It is the 24th of June in the year 217 BC, and we are in present-day Italy at Lake Trasimene, a little over 150 kilometers north of Rome. It is the scene of one of the most famous battles of the so-called Second Punic War, a monstrous 17-year clash between Rome and North African Carthage, but also of all antiquity. On one side will stand 30,000 soldiers of the Roman legions. On the other side will be an army of 50,000 led by the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. Hannibal manages to lure the Romans into a narrow strip of land between the lake shore and the surrounding steep hills. Then his cavalry closes off the retreat route on both sides, and from the surrounding hills, the quietly waiting Carthaginian infantry descends on the Roman army. It's actually a classic ambush, which is commonly used for battles between tens or hundreds of men at most. But Hannibal was able to use this tactic even in the midst of armies of 10,000. Something like this is probably unprecedented in military history. The result is terrible. The Roman legion has to retreat in the only free direction into the lake. But even there, the Carthaginians, known as Punic people in Rome, will conquer it by the thousands. 15,000 Roman soldiers, including the commander, the consul Gaius Flaminius, perish, and another 15,000 fall into captivity. Only a lucky few manage to escape. In Rome, the news of the battle's outcome causes panic, and it opens the way for Hannibal's army to move south into Italy. But the decisive events and twists of the Second Punic War are yet to come. The time and family into which Hannibal was born in the year 247 BC predestined his entire life's path. His father, Hannibal Barca, was a general and served as commander-in-chief of the Carthaginian forces in Sicily during the First Punic War. When Carthage, a city-state located in what is now Tunisia, and until then the greatest power in the Mediterranean, lost Sicily, Sardinia and Corsica, it came as a shock to Hamilcar. Legend has it that he had his three sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal and Magon, swear as children that they would determine the fate of Rome with fire and iron as soon as their age permitted. At the age of 9, Hannibal and his two younger brothers followed their father to Hispania, modern-day Spain, which Carthage gradually conquered as a new colony after losing the island. Hamilcar was very successful here, and Carthage was returning to its former prosperity thanks to his territorial gains. After 9 years in Hispania, however, Hamilcar drowned in the Juca River during a campaign, and when his son-in-law and successor was assassinated 7 years later, the 26-year-old Hannibal became the commander-in-chief of the Carthaginians in Hispania. It was only a matter of time before the interests of Rome and Carthage clashed again. This happened very soon, and in 218 BC, the Second Punic War began. Hannibal decided not to wait for the Romans to come and overtake them. Thus was born a risky venture that at the time bordered on madness. Hannibal and 100,000 men first crossed the Ebro River, then the borderline between the Carthaginian and Roman spheres of influence, then continued on across the Pyrenees into what is now France. This was already challenging. Along the way, many of his soldiers died of disease or in battles with local tribes, others deserted, and 40,000 had to be sent back under the command of his brother Hasdrubal to defend the territory in Hispania against the expected Roman attack. He was left with about 38,000 men and 37 specially trained war elephants. He planned the unthinkable for this entire army. He knew that the plain off the coast from the sea in front of the land was very well guarded and that he had no chance of passing through. So he decided to cross the snow-covered Alps. In late autumn, with people who were used to a warm, often even desert climate, it was hell. His army was mowed down by frost, hunger and attacks from the mountain tribes, so that when Hannibal finally descended into the Pannonian plain after 15 endless days, he had only 26,000 men left. But when Hannibal's soldiers, tired to death, pulled themselves together, and their general replenished their numbers with some of the local tribes that had rebelled against the Romans, his gamble began to bear fruit. As late as December of the year 218 BC, he decimated the Roman legions on the Trebia River in northern Italy. 30,000 Roman soldiers did not return from the battle. 6 months later at Lake Trasimene, the situation was similar. Dead bodies covered the surface, the Roman survivors were sold into slavery, and the captives from local tribes were released. Hannibal was trying to persuade them to fight together against Rome. Both of these victories were the result of Hannibal's fantastic tactics. After them, the Carthaginian army avoided the city of Rome itself and continued on to Italy, where it established a solid base during the following year. It was like a bad dream. Never before had an enemy ravaged the very core of the Roman Empire. They chose what is called a war of attrition. They launched small, targeted raids against the Carthaginians, trying to cut them off from resupply and new troops. Hannibal himself went through an unpleasant period, as he was blinded in his left eye due to untreated inflammation. But none of this stopped him from plundering all of Italy and trying to provoke the Romans into one last decisive battle. It's Hannibal's most famous victory ever, a battle that military theorists still regard as a display of brilliant tactics and still lecture about to military school students more than 2 millennia later. It took place at the now defunct settlement of Cani in southern Italy near the Adriatic coast. The Romans put together the largest army ever to face Hannibal. 8 legions, over 85,000 men in all. Hannibal himself had only about 50,000 warriors at his disposal. Yet he accomplished the incredible. He let the Romans attack the center of his infantry. His units slowly retreated, but the flanks, where he kept his excellent cavalry, remained under his control. The Romans were essentially fighting their way into an increasingly tighter encirclement, which the Carthaginian cavalry eventually closed. But there was an indescribable bloodshed, as the helpless Romans trapped in the middle of the battle had to watch their fellow soldiers being slaughtered by the thousands on the fringes before dying. Estimates of Roman casualties range between 50 and 700,000. More than 100 members of the highest Roman circles, including 80 senators, also perished. In a word, it was a disaster. It seems incomprehensible, but even this triumph did not mean victory for Carthage in the war. First and foremost, Hannibal refused to march on the city of Rome itself and capture it. He doubted that he could conquer a city of 500,000 people without the heavy siege equipment he lacked and with his exhausted and battle-weary troops. Instead, he offered Rome a surrender and a more or less generous peace treaty. And it was at this point that the difference in the nature and political system of the two warring parties became apparent, which ultimately decided the whole war. The Romans refused to discuss the surrender, and were deaf even to offers of peace. The country was united. Members of noble families volunteered to fight. 17-year-old boys and 60-year-old veterans joined the army. The Romans did not even withdraw their troops from the provinces. They knew that they would not be able to extinguish any potential new war fronts. Also, most of their allies were so in awe of them that they remained loyal. Because of all this, the Romans were able to withstand a series of crushing defeats as horrific as almost any nation before or since. In Carthage, on the other hand, hesitancy and deep internal contradictions were evident. After the stunning victory at Cannae, domestic politicians refused to send the reinforcements and equipment Hannibal requested to Italy, preferring instead to defend Hispania, which the Romans had attacked. Hannibal then continued to campaign in Italy for nearly 13 more years. He won other great victories, was never defeated, but could not decide the war for himself. Once he even stood in front of the walls of Rome, but he did not dare to attack them. Thanks to this, however, the saying Hannibal ante portas has survived to this day. It est Hannibal at the gates, which was used in Rome as a synonym for any mortal danger. Perhaps Hannibal's last hope faded in 207 BC, when he was supposed to join forces with his brother Hasdrubal, who, like Hannibal, crossed the Alps with substantial reinforcements. But Hasdrubal had been defeated before that in a battle on the Meteorus River in central Italy. Hannibal learned of this in a drastic way. Roman messengers brought him his brother's severed head. When Hannibal saw it, he spoke the words, "Now I see the fate of Carthage." He was right, for in Rome he had grown a rival who had spent 10 years patiently learning from him. Publius Cornelius Scipio is the man Hannibal's brother's soldiers killed in one of the many battles of his father and uncle. Scipio first broke the Carthaginian power in Hispania, and then persuaded the Senate to allow him to sail directly to Africa, and there bring the whole war to a victorious conclusion. Thus Hannibal also returns to his threatened homeland after 35 years abroad, and the two great warriors meet on the eve of the Battle of Zama, where Hannibal proposes peace to Scipio. He refuses.
If I had said you would have come Roma when their doors were open, we would not be here now. You didn't finish it. Then so I'm ending it now. Don't make it personal. This has been personal since the moment you came to Roma land.
In the battle itself, Scipio first cleverly eliminates the attack of Hannibal's elephants, and in the end, following Hannibal's example, sends his cavalry into the rear of the Carthaginian infantry. It's over. Hannibal loses the battle and the war. Scipio at least shows him respect by not demanding his extradition, but the other peace terms for Carthage are very harsh. And so although it might have seemed impossible after the Battle of Cannae, the Second Punic War ends with a landslide victory for Rome. Carthage continues to exist, but the time is approaching when it will lose the struggle for bare survival.